July 15th, 1887. The icy wind whipped across the deck as the small ship named the Marigold cut through the waves. James Thornton stood at the bow, squinting through the fog that clung to the water like a ghostly shroud. Behind him, his crew of 6 men moved cautiously, each step echoing across the wooden boards of their vessel. They had been searching for the shipwreck for weeks, an ancient treasure-laden galleon lost centuries ago in a storm that no one had survived. Whispers of its disappearance had haunted local sailors for generations, and now Thornton believed they were on the verge of making history. "There it is," Mark, the first mate, called from the lookout, pointing ahead. "She's stuck between the rocks." James followed the direction of his hand, and sure enough, a dark shape emerged from the mist, leaning heavily on the jagged cliffs like a giant skeletal carcass. It was unmistakably the wreck they had been searching for, the San Mateo, a Spanish ship that had vanished over 300 years ago, supposedly during a great storm. Tales of its lost riches had lured men for years, but none had ever returned. The eerie quiet that hung over the sea as they approached was unsettling. The ocean, normally alive with the sound of waves and wind, seemed almost dead around the wreck. As the treasure hunters closed the distance, they could see the ship's rotten timbers jutting out at strange angles, a broken mast swaying gently in the light breeze. The wreck seemed frozen in time, preserved by the salty air and isolation. "All right, lads," James called, his voice carrying a sense of false bravado. "Let's see if this ghost ship lives up to the stories." As they boarded the ancient vessel, an unnatural chill settled over the men. The silence was thick, pressing against their skin as they explored the wreck's upper decks. The old ship creaked under their boots, and the air smelled of mildew and decay, a sickening blend of salt water and rotting wood. It was as if the ship was still mourning its long-dead crew. "This place is giving me the creeps," one of the younger men muttered, glancing nervously around. "Doesn't feel right." "Shut it," Mark hissed. "We're here for the treasure, not to spook ourselves out." But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they moved deeper into the wreck, strange sounds seemed to follow them, distant footsteps that none of them had made, and faint whispers that seemed to rise and fall with the sea breeze. At first, the men brushed it off as nerves, the product of their excitement and the oppressive atmosphere. But the whispers grew louder, almost intelligible, as if someone, or something, was speaking just out of earshot. James stopped at the entrance to what had once been the captain's quarters. The heavy door was hanging off its hinges, and beyond it, the interior was shrouded in shadow. "I'll check this room," he said quietly, feeling the weight of the darkness ahead. Inside, the air was thick, damp, and suffocating. His lantern flickered weakly, casting feeble light on the skeletal remains of what appeared to be the ship's captain, slumped against a desk. The captain's uniform, though tattered, still clung to the bones, and a rusted sword lay at his side. A faded journal rested on the table, its pages yellowed and crumbling. James reached for it, but the moment his fingers touched the leather cover, a cold gust of wind blew through the cabin, snuffing out his lantern. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers that had been faint outside now swirled around him, louder and more insistent. He could hear them clearly now, overlapping voices in a language he couldn't understand. They were everywhere, above, below, behind him, rushing through the narrow space. He spun around, his heart racing, and that's when he saw it. A figure, faint but unmistakable, standing at the doorway. It was translucent, its features indistinct, but it was dressed in the same tattered uniform as the captain on the floor. The ghostly figure raised its arm, as if beckoning James to follow. James stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose board, and he crashed to the ground. The lantern rolled away, its glass shattering as it hit the floor. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, the air around it thick with a cold that cut straight to the bone. "James," Mark's voice called from outside. "What's taking so long?" But James couldn't speak. His eyes were fixed on the spirit, its face now visible. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips twisted in agony. It moved soundlessly, closing the distance between them. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the suffocating cold in its wake. Scrambling to his feet, James rushed out of the cabin, his pulse hammering in his ears. The others were waiting for him, their faces pale and drawn. The oppressive silence had returned, but it was clear that they had all felt it, the strange, suffocating presence that haunted the ship. "There's something wrong with this place," James whispered, his voice hoarse. "We need to get out of here." But as he said the words, the fog thickened around them, swallowing the ship in a dense, impenetrable blanket. The ocean seemed to close in, the stillness more threatening than ever. And then they heard it, a distant cry, like the wail of a man lost at sea, echoing across the water. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Before they could react, the wreck shuddered violently beneath their feet, the ancient timbers groaning as though the ship itself had awoken. And then came the whispers again, louder, more frantic this time. The dead were stirring. James looked out toward the horizon, but there was nothing to see. They were alone, trapped on a forgotten shipwreck with no way out. The ship's crew hadn't left after all. They had been waiting for centuries, and now they wanted something that wasn't treasure. The ship groaned beneath them like a living thing, its skeletal remains trembling under the weight of centuries. James's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he struggled to stay upright. Around him, his crew looked just as terrified. The fog was so thick now that it felt like a physical force, pressing against them, swallowing their lantern light. "James, what the hell is happening?" Mark's voice was strained, his eyes darting around in panic. He clutched his lantern as if it were a lifeline, though its flickering flame did little to push back the shadows. James opened his mouth to answer, but another sound cut through the tension, the unmistakable creak of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, moving slowly across the deck toward them. The men turned as one, their eyes fixed on the fog. Shapes moved within it, dark figures gliding silently through the mist. The crew of the San Mateo. "They're here," one of the men whispered, his voice trembling. "The stories, the legends, they're true." The shapes in the fog began to materialize, ghostly apparitions, their faces twisted in agony, eyes hollow and black. Their uniforms were tattered, the remnants of a life long past, and their skin hung off their bones like wet parchment. They moved toward the men with purpose, but there was no life in their movements, only the relentless pull of some ancient need. James stepped back, his hands shaking. "We need to leave, now." But before they could react, the ship shuddered again, more violently this time. The timbers beneath their feet cracked and splintered, sending one of the crew members tumbling to the deck. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. "What do they want?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Why won't they let us go?" James shook his head, his mind racing. "The treasure," he muttered. "It's not just gold they're guarding, it's something more." The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the ghostly crew advanced. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around the men like a storm. It was then that James understood. They were not just haunting this wreck, they were bound to it. Trapped between life and death, the spirits of the San Mateo had been waiting for someone to find them, to understand. "We're not supposed to be here," James said, his voice hoarse. "This isn't about treasure. They want us to release them. They want to be free." The others stared at him in disbelief. "Release them? How?" Mark demanded. "I don't know," James admitted, fear gnawing at his insides. "But I think we need to find the captain's remains. There must be something there. Something that ties them to this place." The idea was insane, but it was the only thing that made sense. The spirits weren't here to protect treasure. They were here because they were trapped, bound to the wreck by whatever fate had befallen them centuries ago. "We need to go back below deck," James said. "We have to find the captain's cabin." Reluctantly, the men followed him, though none of them seemed eager to return to the ship's depths. The fog curled around them as they made their way down the creaking staircase, the temperature continuing to drop. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became, pressing in on them from all sides. They reached the captain's quarters, and as they stepped inside, the room felt different. The oppressive weight of the air, the cold, it was as if they had stepped into a place frozen in time. The skeletal remains of the captain were still there, slumped over the desk, his journal lying open beside him. James approached the desk cautiously. The journal's pages fluttered in an unseen breeze, and as he looked closer, he saw that the writing was not just ink. It was scratched into the paper, deep gouges that told the story of the captain's final days. He knew, James whispered. He knew they were cursed. The journal described the storm, the crew's panic, and the realization that they were not alone. The captain had written of strange voices, apparitions that had appeared to him in the night. By the time the storm had passed, the crew had been lost, either dead or driven mad by the whispers. In the final entry, the captain confessed to an act of desperation. He had attempted to appease the spirits by offering them his own soul, hoping to break the curse. But it hadn't worked. The curse had bound him and his crew to the wreck, forever trapped in a state of limbo. "We have to destroy this," James said, his voice tight. "The journal, the captain's remains, it's all part of the curse." Before anyone could respond, a figure materialized in the doorway. It was the captain, his ghostly form more solid than the others. His eyes burned with an unnatural light as he raised his hand, pointing directly at James. The room erupted into chaos. The lanterns flickered wildly, the wind howled through the broken windows, and the ship seemed to groan in agony. The spirits surged forward, their whispers turning into guttural cries. James grabbed the journal and hurled it into the fire pit at the corner of the room, the old pages catching fire immediately. As the flames consumed the journal, the captain's form flickered, his twisted face contorting in a final scream of rage before he disintegrated into the mist. One by one, the spirits of the crew followed, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. The ship gave one final shudder, and then everything was silent. James and the remaining crew stood in stunned silence, the fog around them slowly lifting. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by the gentle warmth of the morning sun rising on the horizon. They had survived, but the wreck of the San Mateo had claimed another part of their souls. As they looked back at the skeletal remains of the ancient ship, they knew that it would soon vanish beneath the waves once more, its crew finally laid to rest. But deep in their hearts, they knew something else, something darker. The spirits might be gone, but the curse of the San Mateo would never be forgotten, not for them, and certainly not for those who would come searching for its treasure again.